back together. Proverbs. So we have modern examples. I've collected a few here. You've heard these before. That's, they're memorable, short, pithy sayings. These are outside of the Bible. An apple a day keeps the doctor away. The early bird catches the worm. A stitch in time saves time. Where there's a will, there's a way. So we use these all the time, even in our modern conversation. So the pithy saying, the proverb's brief, it's grounded in experience, arises from careful observation of life and experience. It's expressed in a memorable form, and it claims to have or present some valuable insight, skill to life. So I talked about the difference in reading Proverbs in terms of understanding, you're not reading it like the book of Exodus in terms of historiography, the combination of history and theology. It's not really getting us to particular people, places, things, and events in history when we're reading Proverbs. It's just kind of a snapshot in the daily life of someone, in this experience kind of thing. So that's what we have here. But we can supply kind of an overarching context with regards to trying to understand the proverb. Basically, that the proverb is, in terms of author and audience, the author is intending to communicate some practical application of Torah, Torah instruction within the life of the believing covenant community. I mean, that's the basic overarching interpretive strategy for all of these proverbs. Sometimes we run into problems when we rip the proverb out of its historical context and try to force it into some 21st century modern application, and we kind of force it that way. We get into trouble when that happens. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Well, let's just take a look at one example that I'm not trying to be mean, but may fall into this category. Proverbs 31. All right, Proverbs 31. Proverbs 31 is the last proverb. And it begins with words from, this is the King Lemuel, the oracle which his mother taught him. And what, O my son, and what, O son of my womb, and what, O son of my vows? Do not give your strength to women, or your ways to that which destroys kings. It is not for kings, O Lemuel. It is not for kings to drink wine, for rulers to desire strong drink, lest they drink and forget what is decreed, and pervert the rights of all the afflicted. Give strong drink to him who is perishing, and wine to him whose life is bitter. Let him drink and forget his poverty, and remember his trouble no more. Open your mouth for the dumb, for the rights of all the unfortunate. Open your mouth, judge righteously, and defend the rights of the afflicted and needy. And then, oh, by the way, let me talk to you about how to find the most excellent woman. So then we have the Proverbs 31 woman, who's just around the corner. So this whole context here, advice to the king, to a young king. You see in verse 3, don't get careless in your relationships with members of the opposite sex. Verses 4 through 7, don't let yourself be controlled by your addictions, drinking alcohol or other things. Stay involved, verses 8 through 9. Stay involved in meeting the needs of the poor and needy in your kingdom. So things like that, practical advice for a young king. And then he moves on into 20 more verses here that ends the Proverbs 31 to describe the excellent wife, or perhaps the qualities of the kind of wife to be sought after by the king. And that's where we meet up with her. So we educate our young Christian men to look for a wife that looks like her, who exhibits all 24 of the traits, the Proverbs 31 woman traits that come from these 20 verses. 24 traits from 20 verses. And this actually is an advertisement for a conference. So there's all these conferences and this whole modern phenomena of the Proverbs 31 woman. being a little feisty here. I'm sorry. Just the overwhelming amount of things that come from how to be a Proverbs 31 woman. Weekend seminars, perhaps. How many of you have ever attended one? How to be a Proverbs 31 woman. How about you guys? Have you ever attended one? I'm just kidding. I've met a few. I mean, I'm not trying to overdo this. I think my wife went to one once, and she came back feeling a little bit under the pile, feeling like she might never measure up to the Proverbs 31 woman. I don't know. That's just, maybe I'm being too mean, but let's talk about it. I think it's a good proverb to kind of bring into this conversation. How are we to approach this, this list of description of the Proverbs 31 woman, beginning in verse 10 down through verse 31? Well, one of the things, I think it's fair to say, we have to be realistic with regards to context. By 11th century BC standards, that's what we're talking about here, the Proverbs 31 woman is operating in an agrarian culture where food preparation and feeding and caring for the needs of the members of the household structure, right, was number one responsibility for the ranking female head of household. So we're talking about household structure here. Not like the traditional family farm where someone and maybe a team of, in this case, perhaps the wife of the farmer and maybe a few others who would be there to assist. But you've got a whole team of men who would be out in the fields, and this whole household structure would be needed to be fed in the kind of the events of the day, in terms of this is an important kind of a business operation that's going on. The household structure, as we know, we've talked about this before, involved the male and the female head in terms of the structure. We talked about the firstborn son, the number one ranking son, whose role would be to step in and take over leadership should the head of household be killed in battle or out in the field accidentally or whatever. So that would provide for the ongoing operation of the household structure. This would also include male, female workers, servants, and slaves, who would all be part of the household structure, serving and contributing to all of the activities that would be a part of this household structure. And think of the household structure almost like a small business. All right? You'd have a mini business is really what we're talking about. The households of the community, all of these households working together in a covenant cooperation, under covenant relationship to build the economy. And that's what would be going on. Trading of goods, exchanging of food for things that were made or handmade goods and wares, all of these would be part of the exchange. So the businesses, the household structures would be not only growing the food, but also involved in a secondary operation of producing, maybe making clothes or woodworking or metalworking or some kind of other kind of trade. The Proverbs 31, 10 through 31 really describes the highest ranking female who's involved in this operation. What is her role in the midst of this household structure, and this, really what we're describing is this mini business? That's Proverbs 31. And as an active covenant community, member of the covenant community. All right, so let's keep going. So in describing what are some of these Proverbs 31 descriptions, she works with her hands. We see some of these come from the text. But that's true for everybody in those days. Everybody was working with their hands. The description is she rises before dawn and organizes the servants and the production of food, which, by the way, in the agrarian society in that time was the most time-consuming operation. You didn't go to, Kroger or, Aldi's. I like to go to Aldi's. Have you ever gone to Aldi's and bought your full cart of groceries and you did the price comparison to what the same cart would compare to, like, say, a Albertsons or a Kroger? It's amazing. How does that happen? And you go through all these, you only just buy. There's only one selection of something. So you don't waste your time figuring out, is it going to be this French dressing or is it going to be this French dressing? That was just one. maybe 2 at the most, but anyway. Number 3, buys and sells land from the household business, expanding the property, for example, or involved in a business like clothing, crafts, and food surplus to be sold in a city market. She's a night owl, which basically just describes her as being hardworking. In her free time, she has a side ministry to the poor of the city. Well, we've seen that in the description. A good covenant community working together does care for the poor in their community in some way. They're involved in that. That's an expression of covenant fidelity. She organizes the production of clothing for the members of her household. She supports the male head of the household and his business ventures. She's participating in trading with merchants with garments and linens. That perhaps is her side business in the downtown shopping area. She speaks in wisdom and always responds to difficult people with kindness. You know, a head of household in this particular case is not served well to be a hothead. Got to keep your cool, pressure situation. You're a business owner and manager. You're an extension of the head of household, who's your husband, and helping him and manage this thing. She uses her time wisely. She's a good time manager during the day. That's a description. She strives for excellence with both her household and within, as she expresses her or represents her household in the community. And then finally, she recognizes that beauty is not an outward thing, but is appreciated as an inward quality, to be appreciated by her husband. I kind of reworded that one in my own words. So I think understood in its historical context, any one of these descriptions could be worded in such a way as could be a helpful, timeless principle, right? To describe more of a modern description, taking it out of its historical context, but being sensitive to the fact that we don't want to overkill it in the modern context because we fail to recognize, well, why does she have to get up and make her own bread at the crack of dawn every day? Is that really necessary when I can go buy bread in the store? What's the difference in my role now as the head of household? And how is that different from the role of the female head of household back then? You've got to keep that break in terms of your thinking process, in terms of application. And I know that there's conferences out there that don't overkill it and handle it responsibly. But it's not a oh, here we are. There's my female head of household, Ellen. And I took a Proverbs 31 check and made a list as her husband, her head of household, and described the Proverbs 31 woman for her. I encourage you husbands currently or you future husbands to take a stab at this. In other words, come up with your own Proverbs 31 list and describe your wife. That's a good Bible application for us guys. She's beautiful both on the outside and the inside. She's an active and caring for the needs of the poor in our community. She's skilled at managing the financial affairs of the household. I handle macro, she handles micro. She is skilled at delegating household tasks to the members of the household, aka kids, and mother-in-law. She contributes financially to the household through the practice of her trade. She's a practicing nurse. She is good at managing her time. She encourages her husband with his trade all the time. She's always dealing with difficult people with kindness. It's a skill that she has as a nurse. She always strives for excellence as she represents our household to the community, and we always try to have a ministry of outreach within our neighbors. She remains a committed and loving mother to the children, members of the household. And she continues to impart wisdom to our children, even though they have established households of their own. So there you go. That's my list for her. I encourage all you husbands to do the same as a proper application of the Proverbs 31 woman. So in studying Proverbs, we can... You like that? Another way to study Proverbs is to identify one of those major themes. And then what we can do is look and collect Proverbs that speak to that theme as a kind of like a Bible study or as a sermon. You can do this for a sermon preaching series as well, you pastors out there. It's another way of handling Proverbs or in Sunday school or whatever. So these common themes emerge on topics that would be major themes that would be true for a believing covenant community, like the theme of lying. The liar is one of those themes. How is the liar to be addressed? We start with the Ten Commandments, right? This is another example of, well, it starts with Exodus chapter 20, verse 15 and 16, the idea of lying. Bearing false witness and stealing are both connected with this idea of being a liar. But in Proverbs, here's an example of how Proverbs amplifies this idea and expands it in a more practical way for the covenant community. Let's take a look at just some examples in Proverbs. Turning back to Proverbs chapter 6, verse 16. You've probably read this before. There are 6 things which the Lord hates, even 7 which are an abomination to him. We go 16 and 17. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood. And then the list goes on. You see that in turning over to Proverbs 12:22. You see how they're not necessarily organized in any particular way, scattered around, but you collect them. Chapter 22. Lying lips are an abomination to the Lord, but those who deal faithfully are his delight. So lying is characterized as a form of hatred towards its victim. To lie is to hate, according to Proverbs. Let's take a look at what that looks like in Proverbs 10, verse 18. 10, verse 18. He who conceals hatred has lying lips, and he who spreads slander is a fool. And then over in chapter 26, 28. Chapter 26, 28. Sorry if I'm going so fast here. A lying tongue hates those it crushes, and a flattering mouth works ruin. But truth, along this theme, truth endures, but lies do not. Proverbs 12:19. Proverbs 12:19. Truthful lips will be established forever, but a lying tongue is only for a moment. So this is, you get the collection and you kind of can see it. Kind of like developing a theme like this allows you to see multiple snapshots of the basic same idea. So lying, practically applied. What does it look like? How should it be avoided? Different ways of understanding lying. Lying is hating the other person when you lie to that person. All important qualities for a believing community. And you can see as an extension of how the Lord's going to bless this covenant community. It's not going to be on the back of a bunch of people who get together and lie to each other, right? Can't run businesses that way. No, a covenant community will be blessed and prosperous because it treats each other and the outsider with honesty and truthfulness. It's interesting. I was last time I went to a large Asian country. One of the things that's going on in this particular country is there's a lot of counterfeiting that goes on. And interesting, people who are investing money, it affects the economy. So people who are trying to preserve their capital are investing in hard assets like apartments and homes and real estate because they can't trust the stock market. The stock market is based on deceit. And nobody really knows what's going on in the financial world because things are kind of willy-nilly, and corporations act this way in terms of pulling the rug out from underneath each other and acting deceitfully or presenting themselves untruthfully to the watching world. You can't invest in a corporation that lies. People don't want to do it, so they're investing in other things. So it's just interesting how that affects, the practical world that people live in. So there's other kinds of themes that emerge out of Proverbs. Not only the liar, the theme of the whisperer or the gossip, the flatterer, the one who flatters, the scoffer, The righteous and the wicked are contrasted as a major theme. The wise and the fool, that's another major theme. And how you use words wisely is another theme that you see emerging. So these are, you might say, theological themes that emerge out of this collection of practical, short, pithy sayings. All right. Let's see. So this is all based, we've talked about it, the fear of the Lord. It's the central idea. It comes out of Exodus. We looked at that, Exodus 20:20, and other passages, and Moses' emphasis on the fear of the Lord in Deuteronomy chapter 10, verse 12 and 13, and in verse 20. Fear here is this idea of the loyalty or the love for the Lord that we have. Love is loyalty. We've talked about that. And demonstrated obedience. So a heart of fear, one who's properly oriented to the Lord, is one who loves the Lord and then who walks in obedience. So the byproduct of this is this idea of wisdom. The more you do, the better you get. Maybe that's the idea of this practical application of wisdom. All right. Let's see. We see the fear of the Lord. We saw that theme show up in the very first chapter, chapter 1, verse 7. But we'll also, let's just remind ourselves it's a theme that continues to reoccur, the fear of the Lord. In Proverbs chapter 9, verse 10, we have another repetition. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. We see in chapter 15, verse 33, the fear of the Lord is the instruction for wisdom, and before honor comes humility. And then finally in chapter Proverbs 31, the very last chapter, verse 3, do not give your strength. No, that's not right. Maybe I mistyped that one. Sorry. So this is an important continuation from the Pentateuch, the Torah. The fear of the Lord is a continuation into the book of Proverbs. So that's really want us to know there. Let's see. All right, well, let's move on to the next idea. What's interesting is in terms of the history of the canon, that is the formation of all of the books of the Bible, the Old Testament, we see this biblical wisdom tradition continue on into what's called the Hellenistic period. So that's really where the Greek influence comes in, the Greek period. And this wisdom tradition, Ben Sira, he was a Hellenistic Jewish scribe and sage. Remember, it started after 100 BC, working at that period in time. Really, he was working more in the 2nd century BC. He wrote wisdom books. One of his that was attributed to him, the book of Sirach, was attributed to Ben Sira. This is also renamed the book of Ecclesiasticus. Maybe you've heard of it referred to that way. And interestingly, this is a book that had some early impact on the writers of the 1st century church, the biblical authors who were operating later, and how Christian theology kind of emerged. What was happening during this time, during this Greek influence period, Hellenistic period, with wisdom, and this wisdom tradition was really wisdom as a concept became kind of the fabric of creation itself. Wisdom, and then eventually what's called the personification of wisdom. Wisdom itself taking on human characteristics or divine attributes, such as wisdom as holiness, the all-powerfulness of wisdom, wisdom as the ability to see, the seeing of all things. And this is some scholars try to make a big deal about this continuation and influence to the New Testament authors, such as the author of John and the Gospel of John. How did the authors of the New Testament choose to talk about for example, the incarnation. What kind of language did they use? The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. That's the backdrop of the first chapter of the Gospel of John, John 1, 1 through 14. You also see this kind of discussion or language used in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 2 through 3. Or let's turn to Paul in Colossians. Let's turn in the New Testament. Colossians chapter 1. All we're talking about here is just really kind of a conceptual idea. So you have to allow the New Testament authors to, they're not writing in a vacuum. They're inspired authors. They're very familiar with certainly the Greek influence around them. It was a Greek culture, looking for ways of describing concepts that had never been articulated before. Things like, how did God become man? How do we talk about that? Things like that. So Colossians 1:15, and in particular here, the incomparability of Christ. So here we have, He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by Him all things were created, both in the heavens and the earth. That's that, the idea of maybe perhaps from the Greek idea that wisdom permeates all of the created order, for example. Wisdom, the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created by Him and for Him, and He is before all things. And in Him all things hold together. He is also the head of the body, the church, and He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that He Himself might come to have first place in everything. So, there's a whole scholarly conversation about that. Just so you know that, this wisdom tradition extends and expands and grows and develops and evolves and kind of gets kind of bigger in terms of the Greek idea. So the New Testament author's challenge was to write in such a way to guard against, right, the heresies that were around, making God to be all God in spirit but not man, or Christ to be all God and He's just spirit, Casper the Friendly Ghost, but not how can he be fully God and fully man? To guard against the heresies. Heresies would either go all one way or all the other way, but not in between. So there's the mystery of the incarnation that was coming in. So this is the language of the day, and the authors of the New Testament were choosing their words very carefully, having to come up with new ways of describing something, but in such a way that would guard against confusing people and leading people down the wrong road. So that was the challenge that Paul had, and the author of Hebrews and the gospel writers as well. So, all right, So now we're ready to transition to another wisdom book. Meaning of Life is Chuck Norris. Yes.
Never heard of it.
Yeah. All right. Sorry, he's overdone, I'm sure. Ecclesiastes. When's the last time you heard a preaching series on Ecclesiastes or a good Sunday school curriculum developed on Ecclesiastes? It's a challenging book. It's one of those challenging books. Interestingly, it raises the heart of all questions. Most people say, what's the meaning of life? But really, Ecclesiastes is not removed, as we'll see, from its covenantal context. In other words, it's not just any meaning, according to the author of Ecclesiastes. I'm going to keep Ecclesiastes close to Solomon. That's just my approach. I think Solomon is responsible for the book, certainly is attributed to him, but as one who's older and looking back on his life, perhaps a life of regret, like David writing Psalm 51 and Psalm 32 after his fall with Bathsheba. He's now communicating to his kingdom, here's what forgiveness looks like. Here's how to deal with sin. Here's what I want you to do when this thing happens to you. So now Solomon is in that same vein, expressing his wisdom, but in the right way. Look, I lived my life, and this wisdom thing was great, but oftentimes I struggled with it. How did I apply my wisdom? I got on some sidetracks, and I took a few detours along the way, and now looking back, I kind of regret that I did. But look, Kingdom, I don't want you all to make the same mistake. So let me write this book and deposit it in my collection of wisdom so that you have it forever and ever. And that's what we have in the book of Ecclesiastes. So it's really deals with the moral aspect of meaning to life. There's a particular kind of meaning that is to be had in the book of Ecclesiastes. So that's what we're going to look at. All right, let's get started here. And so let's ask this question. This is kind of a turn to your person next to you and wrestle with this question. If we think about our culture through the window and how much time, how much energy, how much effort, and how much resources are spent on the stuff in between, right? What? Come up with a few things. Talk amongst yourselves. Give some examples, some practical examples of the stuff in between. All right, go, talk, go. All right, what did we come up with? Still coming up with stuff. Hey, is it working right? Is it working right? The Adobe thing? Everything looks good to you? It's flashing up here for me. I don't know why. Maybe it just flashes when. Okay, I'm just making me nervous here. Everybody can hear at home? Okay, good. All right, what's some stuff that you come up with? What's the in-between? What's our culture going after?
Education.
Okay. What else?
Financial stability.
Finances?
Good car.
Car?
Children.
Retirement?
Family.
Children? Wow. Career, yeah.
Health.
Health? That's big.
Fame.
What?
Fame.
Fame?
Fame.
Oh, fame.
Always the what's next. Like if I can just get to the next phase, like I'll be fine.
Accomplishments.
Yeah, accomplishment.
Personal satisfaction.
Oh, personal. Me. Yeah. That's good. Well, yeah, we could keep going here. It's a good exercise to, if you're teaching Ecclesiastes in a Sunday school class, to turn your Sunday school loose on a question like this to get them thinking about it. I mean, we can go really, we can go philosophical with this and talk about all the various kinds of, this isn't going to be on your, you probably know some of these categories. Existentialism, meaning to life is determined by the individual. Hedonism is that pursuit of pleasure and self-indulgence, or nihilism, just the denial of meaning altogether. These are philosophical categories. Science, of course, I come up with this one myself. Science will eventually overcome death and disease and provide all with the possibility of infinitely long, good, and meaningful lives. The purpose of life is to diminish all constraints on our being, intellectual, psychological, physical, and moral, and to remake the external world in ways conducive to the emergence of meaning. That's pretty good, wasn't it? Socrates, meaning to life is found in pleasure in the present. Einstein, to create satisfaction for ourselves and for others. That's actually what he said. Epicurus, meaning to life is finding and experiencing all the best that life has to offer. Epicurean idea. Humanism, there is no specific meaning to life. Everyone defines it for himself. Which of those is the predominant, would you say, in our current world culture? Probably the last one, you think? I think so too. There's a lot of people that are there. Don't talk to me about meaning. I'm just going to make it up as I go. I'm going to find it for myself. And it's probably picking and choosing from some of the all of the above, really. It's kind of a Walmart shopping cart full of meaning to life. So in Ecclesiastes, instead of asking the question, what is the meaning of life? As I said, it's going to ask the question maybe this way. If life is unjust and God is just, then what is the moral value of life? So there's a recognition of a little bit of the pains that life brings, or the disappointments and discouragements. Ecclesiastes is going to offer really a live nerve, really in your face, kind of shocking at times with regards to that experience, but also not letting go of the fact that there is a God who's just. So if that's true, then how do I make, in this mess of bouncing around, is there any kind of moral meaning to life that can be found in the midst of all of that, keeping everything in balance, And so, on the covenantal idea, if we build this conversation, that really is what's coming in Ecclesiastes. The world, according to Moses, is intentional. It's created. So because that's true, if it's created by a good God, it's going to have value, purpose, and meaning that can be found, that can be experienced. And then the other part of that we learn from Moses is human beings are uniquely adapted and created to tie in or plug into that moral meaning and value to life. We're different than any other created thing. We're asking that question. My cats aren't asking that question. They just look at me when I get home and give me the "I'm hungry" look. That's what drives them. But we're designed and created to function in a different way. We're asking the question of purpose and meaning, and that makes us unique. So, in fact, humanity, as image of God bears, has, you might say, a moral obligation to live in this kind of way, in response to a God who has established, and you might say woven into the very fabric of creation, human beings are to navigate life in a different way. We're to live our lives in a different way, and out of that comes meaning to life. So you see the difference. And, I think a lot of that, it goes back to what, we talked about when we looked at Genesis, as Moses is unpacking the theology of what does it mean to bear the name and reputation of God, as image of God, created in the image of God individuals. That's the uniqueness of the pinnacle of creation on creation day 6, human beings, So we would expect that this might be not only an obligation, but then part of the challenge. And that's what we see when we look out the window. And in fact, our ministries are uniquely placed to help people plug back into the idea of reconciliation and connecting and plugging back into their ability to live their life with this experience of this moral value to their life. Most people are disconnected with the idea of, any of these philosophies is fair game. It's not plugged into anything. It's whatever I want to choose. Or, humanism, I'll just put myself in the middle of the equation and define it for myself. I'm under no moral obligation to any God of the universe, and I can live life however I want to. And that's what we get. And subsequently, we find that, sitting around the dinner table on Saturday night with a couple gals, one who had a child out of wedlock and the other gal's expecting a child, and unmarried, and they're really good friends, and we have them over to our house and, talk about life, and it's just, why aren't you taking your young baby to the doctor? Well, it's just because I have to wait too long, and it's inconvenient. And we say, but you're supposed to be the mom to that baby and take good care of her, and you're morally obligated to do the right things with regards to that baby. And she says, well, I just, it's me. It's interruption to my meaning in life. And I don't like, she's starting to experience motherhood and all these things that, yeah, well, when our kids were that age, we had the same thing, we experienced the same thing. You have to kind of roll with the punches and be flexible. But the most important thing is that you do the right thing with regards to the health of that baby. And she said, you're sounding too much like my mom, in kind of a snappy kind of way. And, she experiences this futility and because she made some choices, kind of outside of the bounds of what she knew was the right thing to do. So it's that ministry of reconciliation. It's sometimes frustrating, right? When you're the one who's trying to be the help giver, because some people don't want to be helped, and for whatever reason, pride or whatever, it gets in the way, and it's just kind of frustrating sometimes. But that's what we don't want to give up on that, because people out there need our help and need to help. We need to help them see the world the way that it needs to be seen sometimes. So the author identifies himself, and let's turn to Ecclesiastes. The words of the preacher, Koheleth, is the idea here in Hebrew, the word that means to gather. Woodenly, we'd say literally preacher, or one who gathers people together. So that's where the preacher idea comes in. The preacher, the one who gathers, the gatherer. So we've got someone. He's a son of David, king in Jerusalem. So we've got an idea there. That's where it might come, and the idea of Solomon as being responsible for this book, or the authorization of this kind of book, or authoring of this book, perhaps. The interpretive context, like I said, I think I'm going to stay close to King Solomon, writing near the end of his life, looking back, evaluating his life along this line of the moral value of his life, warts and all. And at the heights of his kingship, near the end of his life, looking back, he's producing this book, including the good, the bad, and the ugly throughout. Largely the struggle that he had in this particular book. And like the book of Judges, we have the interpretive key, or you might say the thesis statement at the very end. So it's always okay to turn at the end of a book like this to find some clues as to what might be the theological thread that holds it all together. And you need to remind your other professors, not me, I've only written one, but other professors on campus, verse 12 in chapter 12. Beyond this, my son, be warned, the writing of many books is endless, and excessive devotion to books is wearying to the body. I dare any of you to say that to the president. Oh, cut that out edit that out. I'm just kidding. Yeah, right, yeah. Thank you. I won't see you in a couple weeks. I'll be gone. So the conclusion, when all has been heard, here it is, verse 13. Again, like we saw in Proverbs, fear God and keep his commandments, because this applies to every person. For God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether it is good or evil. God will weigh every act. He'll evaluate every act along this idea of fearing the Lord, this moral value to life. There'll be some kind of balance that on the eternal scale, that this kind of thing might be part of the weighing experience as we maybe at that point looking back on our own life, and there'll be some weighing that'll go on. But anyway, that's the interpretive context. So one who fears the Lord, if we come back to our heart with feet idea, one who fears the Lord will have this proper orientation. And they'll be one who will be more oriented with the ability, you might say, to navigate through life and to be able to, maybe experience and articulate the moral meaning to their life, is one who fears the Lord. So we'll get back to this picture again. If you're this person, according to the author of Ecclesiastes, you have the navigational equipment. You're equipped to navigate through life, which includes, and we'll see in the book of Ecclesiastes, things that happen in life that bring futility and disappointment. There's storms. And these are storms or whirlpools that the author of Ecclesiastes will say, you're going to get stuck in these things. You have to be able to navigate around those things. And if you're one who fears, you've got the internal mechanism by which you can avoid those pitfalls and still experience meaning in life in the right way. And not the opposite, which would be this idea of futility, which he'll introduce to us here in a little bit. All right, so let's talk about that. I like this idea. This is an interesting idea with regards to the one who fears Lord and is inclined to walk in obedience. Maybe you had one of these little gizmos growing up. Let's see if it works here. I hope so.
This is a gyroscope. It consists of a metal wheel mounted on an axle. The wheel and axle spin freely, secured in a metal frame. This simple device can behave in the most unexpected ways. The components of this simple mechanism are obvious, and it doesn't seem to have any special capabilities. Try to stand it on end and it falls over. Try to suspend it like this and it drops. Apparently it can't defy gravity. But spin the wheel and all that changes. A string provides a simple method to spin the wheel. The first thing I notice about the spinning gyroscope is that it resists attempts to change its position. A resistive force appears when I attempt to tilt or rotate the gyro. Now when I stand it on the tabletop, it stays vertical. The spinning wheel is creating a force that holds the gyroscope upright. When the wheel stops, the force disappears and the gyroscope falls. Incredibly, this force will support the gyroscope like this. It appears to be levitating.
All right, but that's an interesting concept. It's the old school gyroscope. But the idea of the fear of the Lord is having that gyroscope wheel spinning. So what different than the average Joe who might be struggling on the street, you're always being able to stand upright if you've got that fear of the Lord. That's that orientation. And the gyroscope is an invention that was also used by modern ship navigation. So it's used by ships at sea to maintain the proper orientation and direction with regards to navigation. So it's interesting for navigational purposes. So in a spiritual sense, we all need our gyroscopes in operation. That's a good, you can use that in a sermon if you want to. But the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's the point that the author's making here. Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And it's the foundation. The fear of the Lord is the foundation for our experience and our acquisition of the moral value to life. So before we move on, let's just do our deep thought picture here. That's Ecclesiastes. That's the idea that we have in the very first word. Vanity of vanities, says the Koheleth, the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. It's the idea of, really it's this picture, the idea of the breath, the wind, the emptiness. There's a lot of different ways you can go with hevel is the Hebrew word idea. But the idea of being empty, he's talking about the empty of empty, emptiness of emptinesses, something like that with regards to how he introduces the theme. So we'll come back after 10 minutes. Let's take our next break, and then we'll finish out the morning.